myself. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Shiva Bhaggan, and I'm working as a software engineer on the AV task project of Ford. So today I'd like to share with you more about GraphQL and how it is different from REST. So by the end of the presentation, I'd like for you to know more about GraphQL and again, how to implement a GraphQL server using a Java at the server side. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen?
I can see it.
Okay, so, sorry?
Said Joyce can see it too.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so what I wanted to start with today is what we're going to talk about. What is GraphQL? A quick introduction on what GraphQL, actually is, and what are the misunderstanding of what people think GraphQL is. And also we'll be seeing of what GraphQL is in terms of a specification and how it is actually different from REST. At the end of the discussion, I'll be showing you how we can implement a GraphQL server using a library called SPQR, and it will be in the Java environment. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt me right away. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along. So first, what is GraphQL, right? So it is an actual query language, and it is actually also designed to build client applications by providing a flexible and intuitive syntax for asking the data requirement by the clients. And I know at this point it might be a little bit too vague because it is more as a definition. It might be too vague to truly grasp what GraphQL is all about, but I will come back to this slide just when we are going to talk about the implementation of GraphQL. Another interesting thing of GraphQL is that it can dig a little bit deeper into your API endpoint compared to when you're building a REST or when you're exposing a REST endpoint. So GraphQL, it can dig a little bit deeper into your API endpoint, and it can pick selective information from it. That is the power of GraphQL. That is the main aspect of GraphQL, picking selective information about. And that is also part of the definition, as what I've said before. It is designed to build client applications by providing flexible and intuitive syntax. You are providing as a client those syntax for asking the data requirement by the clients. If I go to the next slide, now this is another slide that is, it's only saying one thing. It's a specification. It's nothing more than a specification, which can be implemented by anyone. Now, this is what I was actually referring to the demo, that you will be able to see how the implementation of this particular specification is combined in the server side using Java. And again, with SPQR library, because there are more libraries, there is a Spring Boot Kickstart GraphQL library, which you can also use. But I will tell you why I've chosen SPQR and what is the difference between SPQR as a library with Spring Boot Kickstart GraphQL as a library. Now, this is another slide where I'm actually going to talk about the differences between GraphQL and REST. I call a GraphQL more a query language kind of approach, and a REST is more a URL driven, because just for the purpose of the explanation of GraphQL versus REST, right, is that let's say we need to manage vehicles. We have like maybe a system, and we want to manage the vehicles in this particular system. So when we are developing, REST API, so if you look at the right side of the screen, we can see that we are having multiple endpoints, right? We have like post, get, put, delete. That is, most probably how good REST APIs are written, right? Using those, specific kind of HTTP methods to accomplish, maybe a creation of a vehicle, maybe getting a vehicle by ID if you want to get a vehicle, or making a put, request to update a vehicle, and even having, vehicle deletion by ID, right? Now for that, you need to have 4 different endpoints, right? But when you're going to, design the same kind of management system using GraphQL, you don't need to write different kind of endpoints. So this is another thing, right? You will have only one endpoint, which you can name whatever, and as an endpoint name, right? In this case, I have /vehicle/GraphQL. So that is the only endpoint that will be responsible for creating the vehicles, getting vehicle by ID, or getting list of or collection of vehicle, and even performing a deletion. So when we talk about GraphQL, we don't really talk about post, get, put, and delete. We just talk about post. And because it will always be a post, that is kind of the paradigm shift you will see, because you're not, it's kind of weird getting like basically getting resources from the server by performing a post as an HTTP method. But that is actually the switch you have to make when you're going to work with GraphQL APIs. But again, when we're talking about GraphQL, we don't mention post, get, put, and delete. However, we do mention certain kinds of keywords to specify whether we want to get data or we want to make a mutation in the server, right? We want to delete something, or we want to post something, or we want to update something. Well, to be more specific, we talk about queries and mutations. Now, a query is simply a request for information, like getting a vehicle by ID or getting a collection of vehicles. And a post, on the other hand, a mutation, on the other hand, is where we are going to make a mutation which speaks for itself, right? We are actually wanting to make a difference or a change of state in the database. Let's say we want to post a vehicle, or we want to change a particular attribute of a vehicle. Maybe we want to change the paint, we want to change the state of the vehicle, whatever attribute you want to change. You can also use the same endpoint, but it will not be a query, it will be a mutation most probably. Now, the common aspect both have, like GraphQL and REST, is that you can exchange JSON data in both of GraphQL as compared to REST. Another common aspect they both have is that you can use any server-side language to implement GraphQL in the server. So when we talk about Java, you can use SPQR as a library. When we talk about Node.js, you can even use a library to accomplish a GraphQL server. PHP, it doesn't really matter, right? It's not specific to a particular server-side language. Now, the same thing also applies for front-end technology. So if you are using, if you want to build a web application, you can use anything, right? React, Angular, even mobile development, React Native, Swift, or maybe Flutter, right? Doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's just about making the correct HTTP request to the server, right? And it's the same thing. You'll be making maybe a fetch call when you're using JavaScript and AXJS. It doesn't matter, right? It's just the same thing you're going to do over and over again. But the power of GraphQL, that is, again, something you will see in the demo, which will make more sense. What I wanted to talk about in the next slide is the advantage, why we should go for GraphQL, right? Most of the time people ask, why can we not just stick with REST, right? Everybody knows REST, everybody's using REST. Now, the main there are more advantages in GraphQL, but I've just picked up 2 main advantages, which I've seen to be a solution in our problem, right? Whenever we were trying to implement those kind of solutions. So the main advantage of GraphQL was that we are trying to solve the problem of over and under fetching. Now, when we talk about over and under fetching, I would like to give an example, right? So let's say if you have the same system of the vehicles, right? You're performing management like operations, like delete, CRUD operations basically. And you want to render a table in the front end, right? Let's say you're using Angular, for instance, and you want to render a table that shows the user only the specific attributes of that particular VIN, or vehicle. Let's say you have 5 vehicles in your database and you're returning all the 5 vehicles. And let's say those 5 vehicles might have VIN, it might have type, color, and it might have maybe, let's say, 20 more attributes, right? And it might be nested attributes, like a rich document. But as a matter of fact, for a table, you don't push all the data in the table, right? It should be clean. It should be user friendly for the user to see that, hey, this is a table that consists of a list of vehicles, and the attributes of the vehicles are maybe what the user only needs at that particular point of time. He only needs, let's say, the type of the vehicle, and he needs the color of the vehicle, right? So in REST, why are we sending all the data? No, someone might say, well, that's not a problem, right? We can just create another REST endpoint that only exposes those kind of data, only those attributes the front end team or whatever business logic we have needs to be implemented. We can send that data only. But see, this may cause issues in the future because it's not really flexible, it's not really dynamic, right? But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you're building REST APIs, you know that the server has all the control, right? The server controls what data to return to the client. The server also controls how much data to return to the client. When GraphQL, that is not the case. GraphQL intentionally inverts this. It puts the client as to be that particular, in this case, the person to be in control of saying whatever information he needs. Because we can have the same endpoint, we will also have the same endpoint, maybe the same query in this case, and we will only, from a client's perspective, only we want the VIN, the type, and the color. That's it. Even though the vehicle might have 20 or 30 more attributes, right? That is what I'm actually trying to say. Issues like over and under fetching. This is one example I've given, which was that you're trying to solve the problem of overfetching, right? There is too much of data which you don't use, right? You only use 3 or 4 attributes, or depending of your use case. So that is one really great advantage, because it will solve latency issues and those kind of things. If you are maybe having a network, maybe if you have a mobile device and you're trying to make a call for all the vehicles in my system, and you don't really have a great network, right? And you're trying to fetch so much of data, whereas only particular attributes are being rendered, right? So that is kind of one of the use cases. And the other one as an advantage is self-documenting. Well, self-documenting, this is something you really need to see. So I did write a microservice that exposes a GraphQL endpoint, and self-documenting is actually something you will be able to see in the demo. So if I go next to the next slide, you can see a GraphQL example, how a query and how a mutation looks like. And this is, again, right, this is as a perspective of a front-end developer, or, if you're trying to make a call to your GraphQL server and you're trying to get vehicles, right? You can see on the left side, query get vehicles, which is the second attribute or the second inner object of query object. Now, how GraphQL works, it's kind of a convention you need to follow. I talked about query and mutations. There is also one thing which is called subscription. Well, subscription is if you want to create a connection, like it's kind of a WebSocket. You'll be having the connection. It's like when you need real-time data to be exchanged from the server and the client, or maybe if you're creating a chat application. So that is also something possible with GraphQL. But in this example, I'm just showing how a query has been set up and how a mutation has been set up. So it starts with the keyword, whatever you want to perform. You want to perform a query or a mutation, right? So let's say you want to perform a query, and that query should be responsible of getting a vehicle list from the server. Now, I said, right, that vehicle might have 20 or 30 attributes, but you can see the power now of GraphQL. You are only requesting 3 attributes, which is VIN, color, and type. All the attributes, even though they are part of the base object of the vehicle, right? They are not going to be there in your response, because that's what you have actually been requested for, right? So if I go back to the definition where we said that it's an API query language, right? And it is built to, it is there to build web applications, and by providing syntax, right? Flexible and intuitive syntax, which was part of the definition. And this is what I was actually referring to. You are providing as a client, VIN, color, and type. That's it. I don't want anything else, even though I can get more things. But for this particular call, I just need to render a table, and I don't need the other attributes. So just give me this. So this is how the queries, form. And on the other hand, we have a mutation. Now, a mutation is if you want to add a vehicle into the server, right? or into the database. We can say mutation, which is the first keyword following the convention. The second object into mutation object will be an add vehicle that takes in a vehicle object, and it should represent, it should be represented by a key. Now in this case, it's represented by vehicle, see? So vehicle is representing an object, whereas the client provides what the attributes are. It's just when you're making a post call, right, to a REST endpoint, you provide color, type, and VIN. And this is the same thing you do it in GraphQL, but it's just the way you're doing it is maybe a little bit different. Now you can see that when I'm trying to add this vehicle into the server, I'm retrieving back the VIN, the type, and the vehicle image. Now, vehicle image might be something that's getting processed in the server, right? So let's say I'm trying to save this vehicle, which is of test VIN, a type, okay, that is not really good type, but just for purpose of the demo, maybe I would say truck. Then maybe based on the type, I'm trying to fetch a vehicle image. Now that vehicle image I might get it from another microservice, or if you're doing microservice development, or it might just be, a third-party API that gives you vehicle image based on VIN or type or whatever attribute it is. And that will get injected into this vehicle image, and after saving, it will return VIN, type, and vehicle image after performing a mutation as to be an addition to the database. So that is an example of mutation. If we go to the next slide, we can see that we come to an end of the discussion part. Let's dive into the Spring Boot application. I've created a Spring Boot application, started with start.spring.io. I have added some dependencies by default to set up a web server, and I've added SPQR library, which is the library that helps us create a GraphQL server. And let me share my IntelliJ. I hope you all can see my IntelliJ code.
Yep, it's visible.
Okay, let me make it a little bit bigger.
Okay.
Okay, so as you can see, it's just a normal Spring application that consists of a configuration package, a controller package. I have a model package where I store all my beans, my base objects, which I'm going to exchange from client to server. And I have a service layer, right? So what I wanted to show is maybe we can start with a model. Let's start with a model. I have a vehicle object, which is my base object. Well, in this case, I do have only 3 attributes: VIN, type, and color. The nice thing is that you can have this GraphQL query annotation, and this is coming from the speaker library. So if I go to my build.gradle, you can see that this is the library I referred to in my slide, SPQR. And I have another library, which is GraphQL, but this library is just there to have a UI design. So a UI design is where you can test your GraphQL APIs and you can play around with that. So it's just, having that dependency, just injecting that jar through the dependency, and have simple configuration saying that, all the endpoints or the GraphQL endpoint should be scanned from this endpoint, right? So /GraphQL is something I have mentioned in my controller as to be a post mapping, right? So let's start with the configuration class. So how do we configure the GraphQL configuration class in order to start a GraphQL server? It's pretty straightforward. You just create a bean that returns a GraphQL object. Now, what I'm saying here is that, create a new GraphQL schema generator, which is from the GraphQL speaker library. And we are saying use annotated resolver builder. Now, what this will do, it will go and scan the class path and search for annotations. So I did show you the annotations. It will search for the annotations. And it will also say that, hey, with operations from singleton, use all the operations from this class, this IMPL class. And this is basically the interface that stands in front of the IMPL class. And we have a value mapper factor. This is just for Jackson. And what we are returning is the GraphQL schema, right? So what I'm trying to say is that when you're working with GraphQL, you have to define your own schemas. And you actually need to do that, manually. You need to modify, you need to define the schemas, the way of how data is going to be exchanged from your client to your server, from your server to your client. But with this library, we don't need to manually write that kind of schema, right? And that is why Speaker library is really efficient in terms of setting up real quickly, easily a web server using a GraphQL library. Now, having said that, this is the configuration. That's it, nothing more. We are creating a controller class where we are exposing one endpoint. Remember, GraphQL only one endpoint, but it might have multiple queries and mutations. But all the calls, whether I'm going to get data from the database, whether I'm going to perform a mutation, whether I want to save data in the server, right? It's all going to go through this endpoint. Now, what I'm saying in the controller, I'm saying, hey, take the GraphQL schema, because you can see this GraphQL is the same bean I just defined here as to be part of the configuration. So in the controller, I say use this GraphQL and go ahead and execute that particular query that is coming from the request. See, this is the type of HTTP server request. And because we already set in the configuration that all the queries, all the mutations, all the operations, basically, to be more abstract, go and get the operations and get the implementations from this class. So if I open this class, this is where actually all the implementation takes place. Even when you're doing REST APIs development, it's most of the time in an IMPL class. And the same thing for GraphQL, right? What I wanted to show you here is that in my constructor, I just created a simple, list that I populated with some, vehicle object data, so I can play around with the data and show you how the response looks like, right? I have one method here, which I've annotated with GraphQL query. Again, this comes from the speaker library, which helps you to create a query. Now, again, if I go back of what I've said, that a query, you can compare it in REST as to be a get. You want to get information from a server, right? In this case, I'm returning the vehicle storage. The vehicle storage is a list of vehicle object, a collection basically, and in this case, it will return 5 objects, right? So it will be an array of 5 objects with those attributes in it. That is how simple the implementation is of a query. Now, I have another query where I take a GraphQL argument and I say that, hey, that argument should be pointed by a particular variable name called vin, right? This, again, based on your design. And it should be consisting of a string type, a vin. You can provide, and we are just doing a simple filter by, and I return that particular vin, right? And then I have a mutation, which is, again, mutation you can compare as to be a post or a put or anything you want to do, right? That will mutate something in the server, right? Mutate a resource. I'm saying here, take in a vehicle object that should be pointed by a vehicle key. And after getting that vehicle, do whatever you want to do, right? It's your logic, it's your implementation. So having talked about 2 queries and 1 mutation, I will come back to this method because this is part of another topic. I will just go ahead and run the application. Okay, it's already running. Let me open my browser. So here, you can see this is GraphQL. As I was telling you before, this is the other dependency what I have also injected here, GraphQL. And I have some basic configuration inside my application properties, saying that all the queries and mutations, scan it and map it to my UI. So you can see it comes like this. This is how it looks like, and you can see on the top right section you can see docs, right? So this is what I was actually telling you, as part of the advantage that it is self-documenting, right? You have queries and you have mutations. That is what I have in my implementation class, right? So if I go back to my implementation class, you can see I have like 2 queries and I have 1 mutation. And that is exactly what, this documentation section is scanning and, showing the users. Now, if you want to go into the query, you can even see what is the more detailed version of that query. This GraphQL API has the ability to get vehicles by VIN, while you can provide a string type in the VIN key, and it will return you a vehicle. See how easy it is? You can even see the return type, and you can see that each attribute has, it has the description, because that's what you can do as, as to be a developer. You can tell in the description that, hey, this VIN, this speaks for itself. But if you have an attribute that is kind of complex and you want the user to have more, data of what that attribute actually is, you can just provide it here. Now, if I want to execute this get vehicles, let's say I want to execute this get vehicles. I'm saying, like, here, it will be in query for sure, because I'm getting, data from the server. And I'm actually providing that, hey, what query do you want to execute? So if I just rewrite this again, you can also see how easy it is, because it has kind of this auto completion. You can just press on, control space, and it will actually tell you what are the, abilities of this GraphQL endpoint. So let's say I want to get vehicles, right? And as you know, get vehicles, if you look at the documentation, it does not take any argument. So you can easily open another object, and you can just specify, what do you need? Okay, for this call, I want to see all the VINs I have in my database, or whatever data collection you're using, right? So here you can see it's returning you all the VINs, right? Because that's what you've requested. So if I go back to the IMPL, if I put a breakpoint in my controller, of course, it would come in my controller, and then it would jump into one of the methods, the one you are actually, triggering from your client application. In this case, it's get vehicles, right? So it will come here. Now it will just return this collection. As you can see, there are 5 VINs, and there are 2 extra, which I did add here as a mutation. So if I just restart the application once more time. And if I just execute this again, you can see this is actually what I'm getting from that particular array list, right? Now, let's say I want to perform get vehicles by ID, right? So let me, let me write it myself. So query, and I open it, and I tell what I want to do, right? I want to get vehicles by VIN. You look at the documentation, and you see, hey, it needs a particular VIN, right? Okay, so it should take something that named VIN, right? So in this case, let's go for, this VIN, for instance. And I provide this VIN because it's a string type. So, I put it between quotes. And again, I open this because this is now representing the fields I want to get for this particular VIN. And if you don't know, right, what is this going to return, you can always go ahead in your documentation and see it returns a color, a type, a vehicle image, and a VIN. So let's say I want to get color, I want to get VIN, and I want to get vehicle image, right? So if I run this, you can see that it returned that. So this is how the response looks like. Like, there is a data field attribute that consists of one particular vehicle, because you see vehicles by VIN returns 1 vehicle, whereas vehicles will return you a collection, a list. There are more than 1, right? So that is how this works. What I wanted to show you is one more interesting thing. Let's say I want to get the type, right? So those are the 4 attributes that my vehicle can return, right? As to be part of my attribute. Now, if you go back and look into our vehicle object, right? You can see that there are only 3 attributes, right? We have VIN, we have type, and we have color. Now, where is this vehicle image coming from, right? It's not part of my Pojo. It's not part of my bean object in Java. And as you all know, if you have been working with Java, it's like strong type checking, right? So it's kind of a little bit weird to see this. But again, with GraphQL, because of its specification, it's it's basically you are designing the API the way you want it, right? So what I wanted to make clear, right? The point I'm trying to make clear here is that we have another method, and we are saying it's a query, but again, we are taking an input to be as a GraphQL context. You can see that we have a name field called vehicle image. What I'm saying actually is that go in the vehicle object and add this field to be as part of this vehicle object. So I'm taking this vehicle object, my base object, and then with GraphQL context, you can do all those funny stuff and crazy things, right? So that is also a really nice thing, because in this case, I'm just calling a client, which is a third-party API, Giphy kind of with my API key. This is not really important, but what I'm trying to say is that this client returns me a string that represents a Giphy, right? And then it appends it into this vehicle image. So if I do a mutation, right? Let's say if I want to perform a mutation, and I perform, like, let's say I wanna add a vehicle with that should have a color white, and the type, let's say it's a truck, and let's say it's test fin, okay? So if I execute this, you can see it add vehicle, why it's returning everything, because you can see as part of the mutation, it returns you a list of vehicles. So probably it returns you an updated version, right? So you can see the last one is the one I just added. Now, if I see, let me open this Giphy. See, it's just going and getting a random truck image, right? And that is also a part of GraphQL. You can just append attributes into your base object with which does not have that particular attribute at the beginning of your design. So that is one thing I wanted to show you. Another thing is that another really interesting thing is that, as I've already told you, right? I'm making a get by ID. I'm making a get all vehicles. I'm even doing a mutation, right? And if I open my developer tool, and let me hit this one more time, so you can see this one was registered. I'll just go ahead and comment this, out, and I'll be, maybe fetching again this query, which is a get, because I'm getting now. See, this is a different, right? Because one request was to mutate something in the server, and the other one was to get information. So as you can see, the first one, which was get vehicles as a request payload, more, which was get vehicles. This is how the body looked like. You can see that the request URL is localhost 8080 GraphQL, which is nothing else than our endpoint, right? Because I'm getting information. Even though I'm making a mutation, see how it's like, one second, get vehicles. Even though I'm making a mutation, let me do it one more time. And let's clear this. So even though I'm making a mutation, you can see that the request URL is the same endpoint, right? It's again coming to this controller, and what it actually will do, it will redirect to the service IMPL, because that was part of the with operations from singleton, go and search a mutation that is here called add vehicle, because that is what we initially invoked from the client side, right? Now, that is a high level overview of what GraphQL is. The last thing I wanted to point out, which is also really important, and it's actually an issue that we saw initially when we were developing GraphQL, is that, let's say this particular endpoint, it's secured, right? Using Spring Security, or you're just using, for instance, just to be more specific, let's say you're protecting this endpoint with a JWT token, let's say a JWT token, right? Meaning that you need to send this token to be as part of the header, right, in the request. Now, how will you do that using this playground, right? So that is a little bit different using GraphQL, or I wouldn't say different. It's a little bit, it's not easy to do that in GraphQL UI. Well, if you want to do it, if you want to test your secured endpoints, there is another client kind of UI called Alt-Air. This is really amazing. The configuration is kind of basically the same. It's just taking another dependency, obviously, and it has different kind of configuration. So, you can explore that if you want to send, tokens to be as part of your header. So you can see on this side here, there is a button. If you press on this button, what will happen? It will give you the ability to basically add any kind of header you need, right? And which security might be or might not be in your case, right? So that is actually all what I had to cover as part to be, GraphQL and GraphQL. Maybe another extra thing I wanted to show, which is um, another server side application that also, it's a GraphQL server, but it is not based on Spring Boot or Java. This is more based on Node.js with Express, as a framework. So I did create this application using Express generator. So it gave me all those, middlewares built in and all. I don't need to write extra code for that. But the point here is that if you want to set up a GraphQL server using Node.js, you can always look into my GitHub repository to get access to this code. But just to give you a high-level overview is that the flow will be, kind of the same as when you're building REST APIs using Node as well. But another thing that comes into play is this, which is build schema. And build schema is part of, an function from GraphQL as a dependency. So, you see how we are defining all the data types. We are defining them by ourselves. And this is actually also the thing you need to do when you're developing, GraphQL server in Spring Boot. But because of we have SPQR, it will be annotated based. So whatever you annotate, it will just, grab it at runtime and it will create this schema for you. So you can see in my Node application, I did it with manually, writing code to write what is the, so this, you can see this is a return type of my login that consists of a token. And my login takes in an email and a password, which is just, pretty straightforward. And then we have a resolver that implements this particular login. See, it takes in an email and a password, and it returns me a token and a user ID because that's what I wanted to return. And that's what I defined in the schema. So it's kind of writing more code if you don't really use the correct dependency in Spring Boot, because the that Spring Boot starter kickstart GraphQL dependency will actually have the same thing. You will need to create GraphQL files and then define them all by yourself. But if you're using speaker library, which is this one here, you don't need to do that. As long as you're writing correct annotations, then you should be fine. I think that is actually all I had to cover. Any questions you guys have, suggestions, please feel free to drop that, or maybe you can even unmute yourself.
Hey there. Is it Syed?
Yeah, I'm here, Syed. Yeah, so my question is in terms of, you said initially that GraphQL only use post. So what if we like to delete something? So will there be any function within a GraphQL?
So basically, if you want to perform a delete, the way I would do it, I would just create another mutation, right? Just create another mutation and call that mutation, delete vehicle. And again, delete vehicle, probably you will need, an argument, right? Maybe you want to delete by Vin. So you could just have the same implementation, which is part of the mutation. And you can just append it here. Again, you need to, put this, okay, let me get rid of this, right? And then you can do the same thing, right? You write your own logic here. And again, GraphQL will perform that delete in the server using a post method, right?
everything is through post. So
Yes, yes.
nothing in URL, right? As compared to because REST has a URL in it.
Right, nothing. There's no path variables. There is no request params. Nothing. You just post. You just do a post, and all your separate all your logic basically goes in your IMPL class, where you can annotate them based on whatever you want to perform. Right. Really, any CRUD operations you can define. Yeah.
And in terms of, I think if I understand correctly, GraphQL is from Microsoft, or
So GraphQL was developed by Facebook, and it was actually released in 2015, whereas it was internally used by Facebook itself. And then they released it in 2015, right?
perfect. So in terms of interoperability, is it like open source? Because
Yes.
can be used anywhere, but is there any limitation?
No, there is no limitation. As I also mentioned before in the slides, you can use any technology, right? If you are not a Java developer, if you're a JavaScript developer, maybe you're using Node, you can go ahead and you can just go and Google GraphQL, for instance, Node.js, right? NPM, and they have tons of packages which you can use, right? This is the one I used also in my Node.js. So it's fully open source, and it has a GitHub. You can also go into look into the GitHub version, and it's pretty well documented, right?
And my last question would be, because other has to ask as well, if we have REST APIs, can we migrate those to GraphQL?
Yes, sure. Sure, you can. You can even build GraphQL on top of your REST APIs.
Oh, wrapper, it's a wrapper. Okay, nice.
Right, right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question.
I thought I saw. Did anybody else want to come off mute and ask Shiva a question? I feel like I saw someone else try to unmute and talk at the same time.
Yeah, I think that was me. So thank you so much. That was a great demo. That was very detailed. Thank you so much, Shiva. So in terms of product, do you feel it's compared with the REST template, level of support, and the other open issues there on the web? Would you say it's production ready? Does it have the same level of support and active community out there, compared with the REST template?
Right. So there is pretty a lot of companies are using GraphQL in order to perform those kind of operations. Even we are doing that in our projects, and we have been using GraphQL for now. I can talk only of what my experience is with GraphQL. We have been using GraphQL for now for a year, and everything works smooth. No complaints, nothing from other teammates, organizations that are using our APIs. Everything till now has been working fine. A really nice thing is that when you're going for a production ready kind of library, it's always nice to have good documentation, right? So I believe that is also the case for GraphQL, right?
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
So, in terms of authentication, so it support all the OAuth, OpenID Connect.
Yeah, so actually the same thing you're going to do with REST, right? The same thing you can do with GraphQL. It's kind of not, how would I say this? It's not strict to have another kind of implementation of your security, because at the end of the day, it's just having a secured endpoint, right? And the same thing we're doing here, that it's just a matter, it's just of having a good design of securing this endpoint, because this will be your entry point for all your queries and mutations into your server. So if you want to implement Spring security, it's fine. Just go ahead and just protect this endpoint.
Perfect. So, like in terms of endpoint, I mean, sometimes I get confused. So, endpoint is like where your resource is residing, right? Or is it a function or mutation will you call the endpoint?
Yeah, so an endpoint is, so if you are, so are you developing a REST endpoint? Is that what you have been doing?
Yes, REST I've seen,
Right.
like the URL. So since REST uh, has different endpoint, and we can create a slash, right, to reach to the endpoint.
Right,
But
right.
here we are using just a post, and we are using the mutation. So how its endpoint will be different as compared to the REST?
Right, right. So if I just go and write quickly something here. So let's say if you want to expose, in REST, right? If you want to, if you want to save data, what most of the time what people do is like, we just go ahead and, call something like this. This is now an endpoint, right? And now this is one endpoint that is maybe, or this is probably responsible for saving, right? Vehicles. Now you might have another endpoint that is not a post, but maybe a get, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Now in get mapping, now this is most probably you are maybe getting or fetching, let's be more specific, all vehicles, right? And see, let's say you in a use case, or maybe in the future your front end team asks you, hey, do you have an endpoint that gets me all the vehicles, but I don't want all the vehicles having all the attributes. I only want the VINs, right? Or I only want the type of all the vehicles, right? Then what you have to do, you again need to create another endpoint saying that, hey, make a call to, get all, maybe we can be more specific, get all vehicles and get all the types, right? Then again, you see what the problem is? You need to create another endpoint that basically fetching all vehicles with only types, right? Types in response, right? Now, this is the problem where it comes, right? You don't have a dynamic flow, whatever your front end is requesting, because maybe in the future they want another endpoint that only, gives you X or Y or C. Then again, you have to go in your code base and, make the changes. That's what I was saying. The control is in the server. Give the control to the client, and that's when you use GraphQL.
So in GraphQL, there is no need, just one slash, and then we can use mutation.
Right. It's only GraphQL, and then whatever you want to perform, if you want to perform a get, then do this. Just do this. And if you are using a React app or an Angular app, just provide this in the body and make the call to this endpoint. And just make the call to that. 1 second. I think my server. 1 second. Yeah, so just make this body text to this localhost /8080, a colon 8080 / GraphQL, and it will perform the add. If you want to get, just make the same endpoint call, but just make this as a body. Another thing I maybe forgot to say is that another nice thing is that you can even make one API call providing 2 queries. See how nice that is? You can have like, I think I have a syntax issue somewhere. Let me restart this. Yeah. So you can see I'm making I say, I want to perform a query, and I want to perform 2 queries, one get vehicles by VIN and one get vehicles. So I want to get a vehicle by VIN with this VIN. And after that, I want to have another one that gives me a list, which is not, reasonable kind of an example, but just to give you an idea of how we can make 2 queries in one API call. See how the data now looks? It is one object that has get vehicles by VIN. You see it's pointing to this query, and it gives you that data. Now the other one is get vehicles, which returns you a list, see? And now you will get a list. And you can do funny stuff and crazy stuff in the front end, right? If you want to make efficient calls to your server.
Very nice. And then in terms of, in comparison to REST API, you said we will just use GraphQL syntax, and then we can call other endpoints based
Right. Right. If you want to build GraphQL on top of REST, correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Well, with that being said, that concludes our discussion on GraphQL. Don't sleep on it. And Shiva, I want to thank you so much for sharing your awesome expertise and answering questions and just being an awesome community member. Everyone, I want you to know that we will be posting this video on YouTube, and we strongly encourage you to follow us, connect with us, tune in for more events. I will email you all also, since you registered for this event, I'll email you the video. And if you will, I'm going to put some links in the chat. One is our YouTube link, so that way you can subscribe to our channel, see what we have going on, comment on videos you like. And also I'm going to put a post-event survey in the chat too. It should take about 1 minute to fill out. But yeah, so I thank you all for coming out tonight, Shiva. Thanks again. You're awesome. I look forward to future talks.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Jacob, for hosting this event.
Yeah, you're very welcome.